Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Renee Peterson. I am a civil technologist for SMEC South Africa in the Roads and Highways Division, and I will be your facilitator for today's session. Let's jump right in without further ado. The agenda for this evening was Georgie with a welcome and introduction. I will introduce the speakers as they come up to present their presentations. First, we'll look at the 11 outcomes. Then we'll look at the EXA Code of Practice and strategic regulations, engineering reports, NTERs, professional review, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A session. But I would like to encourage you guys to use the chat function to enter any questions as the speakers go along. If you can just add your questions to the Q&A function and we'll address it in the session. All questions will be recorded and the answers will be distributed to everybody. If there is a question that cannot be answered in the session, we will give the speakers some time to address the questions, and this answer will then be distributed to all attendees once the question and answer document has been collated. So first up, we have Deon Visser. Deon completed his master's degree in structural engineering at Stellenbosch University in 2015. He has 5 years experience in consulting engineering at CSM Consulting Services and received his professional registration at the beginning of 2021. Deon's area of expertise is the conceptual and detailed design of reinforced concrete and structural steel structures in the commercial and residential industries. And he has a keen interest in computation of structural modeling. In his spare time, Deon enjoys hiking, camping, mountain biking, and woodwork. Deon, over to you.
Thank you very much. If you can head over to the next slide, we'll start there with just the contents of the presentation. I'll just be doing a short introduction and then discussing the degrees of responsibility and complex engineering activities which relate to the 11 outcomes. And then after that, just head over to the 11 outcomes and go through a quick overview, then touch on each one individually and do a summary of them combined. For introduction, EXA requires us to demonstrate competence to register as professional engineers with EXA, and their definition is competence must be demonstrated within complex engineering activities by integrating performance of the outcomes at the level defined for each outcome. So there you can see how the three topics relate to each other. You'll also see that I put just a few references into which EXA document the information comes from. Everything is in the documents. Sometimes at first glance it just becomes a bit much, so I think this would be a good overview to assist you with a starting point. Then we can move on. Your degrees of responsibility define your growth throughout your career. So you're required to show competence in different levels. It's not necessarily required that you must show competence or that you must achieve the outcomes in each level, but it's important to show growth. So let's say you start at an A, then you go C, D, and E, but the most important one being level E, where they want you to show competence at a level where you performed as a professional engineer. You'll see there in the table under level A, there's really no responsibility for you. It's just getting into it. And then the responsibility level increases, and under level E, you'll see there the level of responsibility to supervisor is appropriate to a registered person. Well, the supervisor is accountable for your decisions as a candidate. And as a candidate, you should be able to solve the problems without any support, or at least with limited support. Then heading over to the next slide. Most of the outcomes should relate to complex engineering activities. So for each item that you would like to use as an example of how you achieved a certain outcome, you'll have to do this check to see if it is actually a complex engineering activity that you can use in your reporting. So a characteristic of competency for a professional engineer is proficiency in solving complex engineering activities or problems. And then when, as I said, when you report on your outcomes, they should relate to these complex activities. If you want to determine if they are complex or not, you can use this table that's provided in the EXA documents. Firstly, see if it is an engineering problem, if it is relevant to your application as a professional engineer. If you include non-relevant items in your reporting, it's usually something that can raise questions. Then at step 2, establish the level of complexity of the initial problem state. So there you'll measure it according to B, C, and D, and if one of those apply, you can go to the next step, where you determine the complexity of the solution path from the initial state. There you have 4 options which you can refer to. The solutions are not obvious and require originality. Solutions are outside the scope of standards. The solutions require information from a variety of sources that are complex, abstract, or incomplete, or the solutions involve wide-ranging or conflicting issues, such as technical and engineering issues and interested or affected parties. And you'll see as you address problems throughout your career, you'll see most of your problems will have at least one of those issues, since engineering problems are usually not just a simple problem to solve. And then the final step, determine the level of decision making required and potential consequences. And so for complex engineering activities, there will always be a decision making element, and that's where your responsibility also comes in. And you have to be able to carry the consequences of your decisions. Then starting off with the 11 outcomes on the next slide. This is just an overview. So the outcomes are divided into 5 groups. Group A being knowledge-based engineering problem solving for outcomes 1 to 3. B is managing of engineering activities. C is risk and impact mitigation. D, exercising judgment and taking responsibility. And E, professional development. And you'll see that all of those items are usually also relevant to the problems that you encounter in the industry. You have to solve your problems, manage the team that you're working with, to perform risk and impact mitigation of your design, and then exercise judgment and take responsibility for your decisions and designs and management. Then Group E being the supporting item for your profession, where you have to ensure that you are up to date with what is going on in the world and ensuring that you stay competent. Then on the next slide, the 3 outcomes of Group A. Outcome 1 is define, investigate, and analyze complex engineering problems. You'll see when they define the outcomes, they use that complex word in most of the descriptions. So be sure to use complex examples. So the investigate and analyze portion could be a design requirement, an applied research and development requirement, or a problematic solution in an existing component, system, or process. Here, the outcome is concerned with understanding and judgment of a problem. So you can't solve a problem until you don't understand what you're dealing with. Then outcome 2 where you design or develop solutions to your defined problem. It could be the design of a component, system, or process, or a recommendation of the remedy to a problematic solution within the outcome of context 1. Here we are concerned with the solution of your problem. Outcome 3 is to comprehend and apply advanced knowledge, where principles underpinning good practice, specialist knowledge, jurisdictional knowledge, and local knowledge. The applicable knowledge could be specialist knowledge with fundamentalist-based first principle analytical approach and develop models, working knowledge of interacting disciplines to underpin teamwork, and jurisdictional knowledge that includes legal and regulatory requirements in addition to locally relevant codes of practice. I just want to touch again on the complex engineering activities. There's the table that's there to define them in your reporting. You don't necessarily have to explain each time why a problem is complex. That's just to use for yourself to see which examples can be relevant. Based on your description in your report, EXA will be able to see whether or not it was actually a complex problem. Then heading on to Group A on the next slide. Oh, sorry, Group B. For the managing part, outcome 4 is manage parts of all of or more complex engineering activities. Managing is usually a big part of engineering where you can manage people, resources, processes, systems, and money. And it involves planning complex engineering activities, organizing, leading, and controlling complex engineering activities. Outcome 5 requires you to communicate clearly with others in the course of engineering activities. This is also something that EXA measures you on during your presentation. So you must be sure to be well prepared to show them that you are able to communicate clearly. Then communication involves strategic, managerial, technical, and wider impacts of engineering work. Material communication includes concepts, analyses, proposals, and informative subjects. The audience includes peers, superiors, persons implementing designs and other work, persons in other disciplines, clients, and wider stakeholders. Communication functions must be performed reliably and repeatable. So obviously it's always important to be able to communicate as an engineer. You'll have a lot of people working above you and under you. You'll also be working for clients and working with contractors. So it is very important that you are able to communicate with them clearly to convey your design intent as an example. Then on the next slide, outcome 6 is to recognize and address the reasonably foreseeable social, cultural, and environmental effects of complex engineering activities. So our engineering affects more than just the project itself. For a public project, there's usually a social and cultural part related to the project. And especially for civil projects, you'll get a lot of environmental impact on your project with a lot of due processes to be followed. This is also one of the areas where they'd like to ask you questions about how the system works. If you, for example, indicate that you assisted with an EIA or had a project where an EIA had to be done, they would ask you a lot of questions there about which authorities you have to apply for. So that can sometimes catch you out if you don't know all the relevant parties there. Then on outcome 7, meet legal and regulatory requirements and protect the health and safety of persons in the course of complex engineering activities. Obviously, this is a very important aspect. Then just A summary of what this can include is direct, indirect, immediate, and long-term effects of engineering solutions, due regard for the principles of sustainability, regulatory requirements that are explicit for the context and are generally applicable, recognition that protection of society is the highest priority. So obviously there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with you being a professional engineer, and a lot of things you have to consider beyond the solution that's just in front of you. Then on outcome 8, conduct engineering activities ethically. It states the ethical behavior of no less than defined by the code of conduct. So it should be a good idea to look at CESA's code of conduct, and based on their code you'll surely be able to find some examples of where you acted accordingly, since I'm assuming everyone here would act ethically as required. Then on to group D. Outcome 9 being the exercising of sound judgment in the course of complex engineering activities. Judgment in decision-making involves consideration of diverse and wide-ranging risk factors, significant consequences in a range of contexts, wide ranges of interested and affected parties with widely varying needs. So also as a professional engineer, you should be able to make capable of sound judgment, be able to make your decisions with the knowledge of the impact it can have on other items of the project or the community. On outcome 10, be responsible in the decision making for part or all of the complex engineering activities. Another one touching on the decision making, which is a critical item as a professional engineer, where you have to be responsible and liable for the decisions that you make on a project. Then the final group, Group E, is your professional development, which is very important. At this stage, you're not required to adhere to the requirements of professional development, but it does assist, or it would assist you to already try and adhere to them to see how it works and how it will impact you once you're registered. And it is here required to show to some extent that you are committed to professional development. So professional development involves planning your own professional development strategy, selecting appropriate development activities, and recording of professional development strategy activities while displaying independent learning ability. Then we can go to the summary. Summary is just to try and tie all the outcomes together a bit better. The outcomes don't stand alone. The complex engineering problems will invariably require the simultaneous performance of several of the actions embodied in the outcomes. Outcomes 1, 2, 4, and 5 are essential functions of a professional engineer, which include analyzing and solving problems and managing processes, projects, and operations to deliver results. All these functions must be supported by proper communication and require fundamental and specialized engineering knowledge to be performed successfully. From those outcomes, you can see that's the basis of your engineering work, and then the other outcomes will just add on to that. With outcomes 3 reflects the importance of engineering knowledge. This is the essence of engineering work. So this can also relate to outcome 11 to improve your engineering knowledge by continuous professional development. Then on the next point, during problem solving and managing, the impacts of the solutions and the applicable regulatory requirements must be dealt with as per outcomes 6 and 7. Next one is some skills are not necessarily taught during the education component but are important at a personal level. A professional engineer must act ethically, exercise judgment, and take responsibility as per outcomes 8, 9, and 10. And then finally, outcome 11 is important for supporting the other outcomes. Professional development is required to increase knowledge and gain the required level of competence for the effective performance of engineering work, and also to keep your professional registration. And I believe that was the last slide. Thank you, everyone. Don't know if there are any questions at this stage.
Thank you, Deon, for that insightful presentation. I'm glad that we had time to dive into the 11 outcomes, so that is obviously very important and both the basis of our registration. I just want to reiterate one point that you made in your summary, which was that it requires simultaneous performance of several outcomes for us to reach our goal. It's not necessarily one, two, or three that are more important than the others.